to present this to you. Everything you want to know about data centers and more. It's going to be a great time. Thank you. We have a great panel here today. Jackie Russell. Jackie's been with New Albany almost 9 years and has more than a decade of experience. Also had a tour of duty in Westerville, but has been a leader in planning as well and has her master's in public administration. So she really has, I think, two different perspectives on it, but an economic development veteran. Chris Abrams, who is director of the information technology sector. Was doing before he came to JobsOhio about 2 years ago. He has 18 years with an Ohio-based IT company serving a variety of industries, so really knows the sector well. And then last but certainly not least, on anybody's radar screen, Brody Leppi, who has as much experience in real estate as anyone I know. He's been with JobsOhio almost 9 years, but before that, had his own brokerage firm, was with another one, and did site selection for Speedway and many, many other things before he came to JobsOhio, and is really, I think, one of the best in the country at working site selection. Is one of the reasons, combined with the project directors and the great locals, why we're seeing so much success. So I think you're in for a treat today. Great panel. This is the Ohio Economic Development Association. I'm here with my partner in crime, Mark Barbash, who runs the Ohio Economic Development Institute, runs our education arm. At the end of the day, we're trying to help you learn more, get to know more people, and be able to have more influence on creating an ecosystem where we can grow the economy. And we're all about strengthening everybody who's strengthening Ohio's economy. You can check us out at ohioeda.com. We are also the seventh largest professional association for economic development in the country at the state level. Our legislative conference has sold out and is happening next week. We're very excited after a hiatus of 5 years. We're going to have a day of policy looking at energy, very relevant to this topic, looking at housing and looking at workforce development. For those that are going to be there at the Plaza Hotel next week, we look forward to seeing you. We're excited about that event. Basic economic development, course, basic economic development course. We've been doing this for 45 years in different organizations, including ours. It is a 4-day intensive foundational course for practitioners in economic development happening June the 2nd through 5th. We are the number one state in the country. Last year, more than 100 people went through it. Satisfaction reviews are it's relevant, applicable, and you get it on there and you really get a full range exposure to economic development. We're excited about the basic course. And then core courses, the next level up from basic, finance and incentives, BR&E, site selection, real estate, and workforce and talent. We do those over the course of the year. Finance and incentives, there's more than 50 people registered, so don't miss out. But those also lead, but don't have to one of the state certifications. We're one of 7. And then Mark has us with a fireside chat. This is available to OEDA members and also in partnership with the APA, talking about pro forma analysis, capital stack. I think this is a fireside chat about planning and economic development. So join us for that. That will be April 10th from noon to 1:30. But I'm going to be talking with Rachel Ray will be our moderator, and then we're going to be talking to the leader of the Ohio APA. And we're going to be talking about how the two differ and how do they work together, because planning is so critical. And that's very relevant to this discussion as well. With that, Mark, I'll turn it back over to you. And again, thank you, panelists, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
David, thank you, and thanks very much to our guest this morning, and thank you all for joining us today for a topic that is highly relevant, even more so than when the first number of data centers got established in Ohio. A couple of caretaker questions. The first one is please post your questions and comments in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. David and I will be monitoring those questions, and we will either ask the questions during the presentation or we'll make sure there's time at the end to answer the questions. And please post the questions when you think of them. Please don't post them at the end, because we really want to be responsive to your calls. In addition, after this session is done, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of the presentation, recording of the webinar, and copies of the presentation. Before we get there, though, I want to do a quick poll of the folks who are in the room with us to just kind of find out why you are here. So we have 2 questions for this poll. One is, what is the reason for attending the webinar? And the second is, what best describes your role? So if you could take a moment and complete that. Another minute, and then we'll close up the poll. Okay, so this is the results of the poll. You're all here for a whole variety of reasons, basics of data center and impact, as well as being informed as an economic developer, but a good number of folks who are here for a variety of reasons. 63% of the folks in the room are economic development professionals. 20% are local government officials. 7% are real estate developers, site selectors. We've got a couple of utility folks in the room, a couple of business people in the room, and then 13% are just kind of interested folks. This is clearly one of the more interesting topics around. So thanks very much for completing the poll. It is my pleasure now to pass this on to our panel. And what we're going to do is, Chris, I'll pass it to you. I'll pull down my presentation. You can open yours. And then, Chris, when you're done, pass it on to Brody. And Brody, when you're done, pull your presentation down and pass it on to Jackie. And as a reminder, please post your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them. Thanks very much. Chris, you're on. Chris, I think you're muted. There we go.
All right. So good afternoon. My name's Chris Abrams. I'm the director of the information technology sector for JobsOhio. I've been with JobsOhio for, almost 2 years. And, David was a little off. I have over 38 years in tech, going all the way back to building mainframes. So I've spent a lot of time in tech and lead the effort on data centers. And as you can imagine, it is, a very interesting topic for everyone at every level, whether it's state, regional, or at the local economic development level. I'm going to start with a little bit about JobsOhio, just in case some of you don't realize who we are and how we're funded, because that's really important for a lot of people to understand. In 2011, in the Kasich years, that's when JobsOhio was formed as a privately held corporation, a 501c4. And our goal is job creation, retention, expansion, and our attraction efforts take us anywhere around the country. And we have an international team, which I will show you, kind of depict that in one of these slides as well. And this gives you a breakdown. In 2013, when we acquired the rights to manage the Ohio Liquor Enterprise, a percentage of profits from the sale of spirituous liquor is how we are funded. There are no tax dollars in our incentives. So it's always a positive impact to the state revenue. And JobsOhio has 7 regional partners, and it's through our regional partners and other economic development people like yourself. We could not do it without all of us involved. And as you can see there, we have a pretty good global footprint. So, and that's how we look at our attraction models to bring companies from, these other countries. And yes, data centers from these countries are looking specifically at Ohio. And I'll get to one of the reasons and incentives as to why that's happening. And this is just to give you an idea of what our statistics are. For every one job announced, 2.3 jobs are created. And what that really means, it could be indirect jobs. And when we talk about data centers here shortly, there's thousands of jobs that are created for the hyperscaler and the major data center projects that you've heard of. But when you look at, we couldn't do this without everybody from local all the way up to Jobs Ohio. But you look at our growth, our CapEx, our investment, those percentages and changes from 2019 to 2024, we've been very successful. And that's not slowing down, especially on the data center side. But this kind of gives you an idea of how we manage our money and how we manage projects. And this down here on the left where it says for each dollar invested returns $17 of tax revenue in Ohio. Our setup is one of the only ones in the country, and other states have tried to create the exact same setup with, revenue from a liquor enterprise. And we're still at the top. We're still, we have the most unique setup for how we bring projects and fund projects within this state. So we'll move on to the data center highlights. We've had a 380% growth in Ohio since 2011. And there were 379 data centers back in 2011. Today, there's over 1,800 data centers. Now, that seems like a big number, but in reality, it could be any corporation that has their own data center. It could be a privately held data center. So these numbers represent a lot more than just the big ones and the big projects you know of and that you hear about. And this kind of gives you our one of the big projects. All of these companies on this map have their leading cloud infrastructure and co-location data center providers around Ohio. And this is to show you, we are looking at it around the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about what else, why they're looking around the state. And these are some of our largest. It's not all of them, but the investment they're making in Ohio is going to continue. When you look at these numbers represent major data centers that give back to communities. And I have a few of those examples in a later slide, but AWS, 23 billion committed by 2030. So there's part of a recent announcement as well. Same thing with Meta and some of the things they're doing. But this represents an ongoing, and this is just 4 of them. And the pipeline is full, and we're getting attraction on data centers from around the world. But that gives you an idea of how big this is. So why are we getting attention from data centers to come to Ohio? One of them is our data center tax exemption. And it allows them, it offers them an incentive and personal property tax exemption on IT equipment, some of the infrastructure, mechanical. And one of the key elements to this, not to get too deep into the weeds, is AI data centers and regular data centers refresh their equipment every 3 to 5 years. So that's why this is really important to those companies. Now, it says up to 100%, but this decision is not made by JobsOhio. It is a recommendation from JobsOhio. The decision falls on the Department of Development. So those are not the decisions made by us. And I think that's kind of a misunderstanding that, we're the ones that make the final, because we've had many of them come back, not at 100%, but that hasn't scared any of them away. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to go back one slide. The other real attraction for this state is we're a deregulated state, which means, and when you talk about energy and power, we're deregulated. So that gives them the opportunity to shop for their energy source or their energy provider. So that certainly helps. And we certainly have our kilowatt per hour price is much lower than many other states. So that gives us some attraction too from there. And then we'll talk about, you know, some of the behind the meter options that are happening throughout the state. So the different types that you're going to hear about, or you may have already heard about, are co-location. Those are multi-tenant, and everybody's probably seen them. They're probably in a, you know, a smaller building, and they'll build out racks that um, for maybe 500 different companies. So that's, and it's just co-location, and it's still cloud. And the hyperscalers, that's an easy one. That's Microsoft, that's Google, it's Meta, it's AWS. And there is, these last two are emerging, if you will. They do exist. They're around the country and the rest of the world. The edge/micro, they're small, they're located near where they're needed. And of course, container and modular, it's the same thing. You can think of a, you know, a modular container, and it's a self-contained data center. It's a very small data center. It has a very specific need. So one of the comments that we've been facing is, have we been doing enough to push data centers in these potentially massive projects around the state? We are, and they've listened, and they are looking around the state. So as you get any inquiries from potential data centers, you may get it from a consultant, you may get it from a developer, but they are looking all over the state. The second comment is behind the meter. I mentioned that earlier. And the reason that's important, because really in Ohio, there are only two options: natural gas, SMR, and of course you have the grid. But behind the meter, it's just natural gas and nuclear. An SMR is a small modular reactor. And we do not have an SMR in this state yet, but it's going to happen. There's some AI push to build AI infrastructure and power and energy sources for those type of data centers. And that's going to happen. And the only thing that people have to get over is the word nuclear. And natural gas is being, you know, considered by many data centers now. And some of the new data centers that are coming to this state are building out an entire energy solution out of natural gas without even touching the grid. And with that, I don't know if Brody will hit on this, but there's two acronyms you're going to hear: a power purchasing agreement, which is a PPA, and an IPP, that's an independent power producer. And those are what's going to be offering up, you know, behind the meter options. And the power purchasing agreement for whoever provides the energy, even if it's an electric company, they still have to have the PPA or the power purchasing agreement in place. The other part of that is, if you are going to be on the grid, and some of you've probably already heard this, that there are data centers that will look at sites and they'll do what they call load studies. It all kind of fits into this as well. And load studies are, can that site be serviced by what the needs of the data center are? And sometimes they will scale and they will phase based upon what that energy provider tells them. That we have different electric providers in this state, and they all have different ways of providing those load studies. So some of the things, what are data centers doing to kind of help? Because data centers, you're always going to hear that they need water. You got to have power. And, you know, we're trying to get to a point where they minimize their water requirements. And that water requirement is sometimes them just investing in their own cooling. And the industry itself is investing in cooling for data centers. So it's changing almost every year. There's some of the hyperscalers that are heavily investing on how they cool. And sometimes it's just about, in Ohio, they have an operating temperature. This is one of the other things that, you know, when we say higher temperatures to reduce cooling costs, they have found ways to reduce, increase or raise the operating temperature without sacrificing degradation and failure. And I think we kind of covered, not all data centers are the same size. We've come across this many times. You can put a data center on 50 acres. You can put one on 20 acres. But the big numbers that are coming out, you could hear 500 acres, 500 megawatts. And those are all decisions. We have a great sites team. We know how to work with them. But we also know that the real question is, can that be serviced? Are you going to phase your project in? And sometimes they'll consider multiple sites. And one of the things with data centers from an economic development, there's induced jobs, for these, it's full-time jobs working in the data center. And then there's indirect jobs. And then there's construction jobs. Now, JobsOhio, we don't count the construction jobs, but for a hyperscaler, you could be seeing up to 1,500 construction workers to build out a hyperscaler data center. And the jobs that have to come along as they turn the switch on, it's companies that support. A lot of the data centers do not support. They have the staff that works in there. You're going to hear the numbers are low. Even for some of the big ones, you'll hear 50 or 100 FTEs working in it. But they contract a lot of that work and that refresh. Remember, 3 to 5 years and AI type of servers. So they contract a lot of that out, and it actually contributes to the local economy. Not only do all the construction workers contribute to the local economy around the state, but those companies also have to, realize some growth to be able to support these new data centers. And these are just some fun facts on data centers. The average data center site, if you hear it, is 100 square meters. And the note on Northern Virginia, they're the largest data center market in the world. We are learning a lot about that because they have had some of their own power issues. And there are other states around this country that are turning away data centers because they haven't actively pursued solutions to provide energy, whether it's natural gas or nuclear, and there's some other options out there. And so when we talk about some of what they use, some of them, a hyperscaler might use 300 gallons of water on a hot day, but that's not every day. They don't use that much water every day, especially in Ohio. If you took the mean temperature, the average, you wouldn't need 300 gallons every day. It's just on the days it makes sense to use it. And it's the design of their cooling system that dictates the amount of water that's required. If you hear something like a closed loop system, you're probably you're gonna have a lot less water requirements. And there's another thing called immersion cooling. This is probably going to come across as odd, but immersion cooling is dielectric water. It is non-conductive, and they will actually submerge the equipment in the water. And it's one of the most efficient ways to cool those type of racks and those systems. And of course, there's direct to the door, direct to the chip type cooling. So that also, can save as well. And we've had some great exposure with Switch. They have the largest data center, and it's in Vegas. It's 7.6 million feet. And of course, the largest data center owner operators you see there. AWS, when you talk about AWS and Microsoft and the number of data centers around the world, if you were to take AWS, Microsoft, and a few others, there's millions of data centers, and they own more than half. So that tells you the investment they're making in cloud-based computing. This is the kind of the feel-good information that everybody needs to know, because why data centers? What do they provide to the communities? And AWS and Google have been, absolutely fantastic with their communities. They come in, they get to know the community, they look at data center tech training, and try to build programs to support. They work with the K through 12 all around Ohio. All of the data centers, we haven't heard of one that has not been, you know, a great partner to the community around it. And since 2022, Google donated nearly $4 million to over 50 Ohio nonprofit organizations, and that supports STEM and workforce development. And of course, Google launched the skills, trades, and readiness, the STAR program that trained over 100 individuals for careers in data center construction through pre-employment training with Columbus State Community College, the National Center for Urban Solutions. And the other one that really should be on here that I have direct experience with is Meta. Meta gives away millions of dollars every year in community action grants. And that's them giving back to the community to support organizations and nonprofits. So a lot of communities out there, and I know somebody's going to ask this question. Not every community wants a data center. And we can extrapolate some of the poll data. Not every community will want a data center because they don't understand the value. So that's kind of what a lot of this is today, to kind of help, you know, answer the questions. And that's all the slides I had. Dave Brewster's the managing director. I'm the director of the technology sector. He's semiconductor and microelectronics, and I'm AI and data centers, and we just run nonstop. But, you know, feel free to ask the questions, and there'll be some, you know, the other side of this when you get into sites. Brody will handle that. Jackie has the wealth of information because she's had all the big data centers in her area. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn it over to Brody.
Thanks, Chris. Mark, I saw there were a handful of questions. You want to attack those now, or you want to wait till the end?
Brody, you're on.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'll just dive into my slide deck and we can hold those questions for the end. Okay. So thanks, Chris. I think what I want to do to start with is just to take a little bit of a step back, give some context for in sort of the broader site selection macro environment that this data center development is happening in. So this first chart, what this shows is the number of site searches that JobsOhio has basically sent out to our network by year since 2017. So you can see that obviously 2020 was COVID, but prior to COVID, if we did 70 site searches in a year, that would be a good year. Every year after COVID, we set new records. And in 23 and 24, we did over 130 site searches each year. So the crazy thing about this is that data centers are basically not included in this information, in these numbers. For a variety of reasons, they tend to go outside of the traditional site selection process. They've got their own real estate teams. They do their own site identification. And so this huge uptick that you're seeing, that's not data center, that's everything else. So there's never been more interest in Ohio than there is right now. So the opportunity is huge. In data centers, I've never seen anything like the demand for data centers right now. Those sites, people are gobbling those up so fast. But there's also kind of an unprecedented opportunity in the other 9 sectors that JobsOhio focuses on. So what are those? Here's kind of the breakdown of those site searches I just showed you. The biggest piece of the pie is the sector that we refer to as advanced manufacturing. Now, it's a little bit of a catch-all because anything that's manufacturing that doesn't fall into one of these other categories sort of lands there. So it makes sense that that would be the biggest piece of the pie. But I still think it's important to note that, you know, the most common projects we're seeing are manufacturing projects. They bring a ton of money into communities. They're good wages. They're great projects. The next most common type of project is automotive. Obviously, Ohio has a huge automotive base, and we continue to see a bunch of site selection projects in the automotive space. Food and ag next, shale, petrochemicals, and increasingly information services and software. That's the IT industry that Chris runs. Really, over the past 5 years in these numbers, as I said, it's a little bit misleading, I would say, because there's only about 5 data center searches in these numbers over the last 5 years. The vast majority of that demand is happening outside of this process. Those companies are, in some cases, we're helping them find their sites. They just don't want to be, they don't want to have these public blasts that they're looking for sites out there, or they identify them themselves and then they come to us and say, here's the sites that we're interested in. Help us get connected with the local communities and stakeholders, help us with permitting and regulatory and things of that nature. So this is sort of how that breaks down. A little bit of an uptick in healthcare. We're getting some momentum in that space. Those are really great projects. Same with aerospace and aviation, of course, with Joby and Anduril, really some strong momentum in some really great industries here in Ohio. So not only are there more opportunities and more at-bats than ever, they are bigger and more complicated than they've ever been before. That top line chart shows the average number of new jobs that these site search opportunities are out there, are put in front of us. You can see a huge peak for both jobs and investment in 22. That was a really crazy year. All the car companies were doing battery manufacturing projects, and there were several semiconductor fabs that were looking for sites as well at that time. So some of those were, thousands and thousands of jobs. Some of those semiconductor fabs were $60 billion plus investments. So it really drove the numbers up. But last year we averaged 645 jobs and $488 million of investment for each site search project that we did. So still well above the pre-COVID averages in terms of jobs and investment. And they are getting more complicated than ever. So again, just a huge opportunity in the world of site selection right now. I know I've said it like 3 times, but that does not include the data center development, the data center demand. So I wanted to figure out, since our data doesn't really include that, I was trying to figure out what's the best way to sort of quantify and show the trend for data center demand. This is the best place I could come up with. AEP gave a testimony to the Senate Energy on Committee on Natural Resources back in May of last year. And obviously, the entire state's not in AEP's territory. We've got 4 major providers: AES, AEP, Duke, and First Energy, all the co-ops, munis. But a lot of the growth in data centers has happened in AEP's territory so far. They reported to this committee that at that time, they had 108 gigawatts of interconnection requests. That is 10% of the total peak electric load for the entire country. In Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, the amount of interconnection requests that they had at that time is 3 times the peak load of our state right now. So it is a huge influx. It's hard to even communicate how much demand this is putting on the grid and how much activity our electric utilities are seeing in this space. And again, for some context, it used to be that maybe, AEP might see one manufacturing facility in a region, one request would be 100 megawatts. That would be a huge project. That's enough power for 100,000 homes. And now, these data center projects, they might be 15 times that. And so it's just a whole new ballgame in terms of the demand and the amount of electricity that this industry is pursuing right now. And I would say that the vast majority of those interconnection requests and that demand and everything that Chris basically showed you, almost all of that happened prior to ChatGPT coming out and to, I think, the world sort of realizing what these large language models and how AI can be intertwined into every industry and every part of our lives. So that's sort of just the beginning. In that same report that AEP gave, they included some forecast data from Wells Fargo. And this chart shows the anticipated electric demand specifically related to AI data centers. You can see in 25, where we sit today, they're estimating about 7 terawatt hours of electric consumption will be used for those types of data centers this year. By 2030, they expect that to be 652 terawatt hours. So just exponential growth in this industry. That's 9,200% increase in demand over just the next 5 years. So if we didn't lose any power plants in the meantime, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment of new generation to be able to meet that demand. which I think also is a big opportunity for Ohio, for a lot of our communities. If you can get comfortable with power plants coming to your community, finding sites that can work for them, they are particularly good for schools. And there's, those are $1 billion+ investments. They're good jobs. So there's big opportunity to get into the game of power generation as well. But as I said, there are this is an increasingly bigger problem, that a gap is starting to exist here, because power plants are coming offline every day. This report estimated 20% of the installed capacity in the PJM network will retire by 2030, and we're not building enough new power plants in the meantime to make up the difference there. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. And Chris is absolutely right, and I think Jackie will give some examples also. Every data center is different. They're not all the same. There are some that will come and say, we could do this with 15 or 20 megawatts. We could do this in a small building. But I will say that for hyperscalers and for this AI demand that you're looking at here, scalability of that site is becoming increasingly important. What they will look at smaller sites, they will build on some smaller sites, but they are really looking at where are sites that we could get a gigawatt plus of power and really start scaling. Okay, sort of along those same lines, I think a few years ago, this was sort of the perception of what you had to have in order to land a data center. It wasn't necessarily always true, but I think the perception was, in order to land a data center, you needed millions of gallons of excess potable water. You needed to have a perfectly flat farmland. You had to have high-speed fiber right there. And I think everybody felt like a lot of these were happening right near major metros because they wanted to be close to their end users, the people who are using that data. People felt like you really had to be close to a metro. You needed hundreds of acres, and you needed a ton of electric capacity ready to go today. Today, I think things are changing a little bit. Chris alluded to this, he touched on this, but you might not need millions of gallons of water, potable water anymore. Some of these companies are looking really hard at reusing water, at purple water. Some of them are looking at air-cooled facilities. They are willing to get creative on solutions that are going to use a lot less water. If they can get water, they'll like to use it. It makes their operation more profitable. In the absence of water, they have to generally have to use more power, and it makes it more expensive. But they are looking really hard at solutions that use a lot less water. We are also seeing them look at sites that I'll say are very topographically challenged. Whoops, I just shut my screen. 1 second here. So significant topographical challenges. So you don't have to have a perfectly flat site. They will get creative. They will spend some money on site work. I think that, if they have to go spend $20 or $50 million in site work to make that work, it needs to be reflected in the real estate price that they're going to have to pay. But they are looking really hard at sites that are going to require some site work. They will extend fiber a long way for a site that is really scalable, that they can really get a lot of power at. And again, they are looking outside of major metros. AWS recently announced a project in Fayette County, which is a fairly rural county. There's several others that are looking very, very rural sites, and there's some, I think, big announcements that will come in the next couple months at much more rural areas. These AI facilities don't need to be as close to the end users as what some of those older data centers did. And so that's really opening up all of Ohio as an option for these data centers. Hundreds of acres, sort of depends. I mentioned there's the whole gamut here of small co-location communities, data centers, something that's going to have maybe a few servers for different companies that are nearby. But then there's also this huge run for very large sites, very large scalable options. Hundreds of thousands of megawatts of electric, that is really the $1 million question. That's what drives these projects. How much electric can we get on that site? How fast can we get it there? There are really significant lead times and delays to get substation equipment, transformer equipment. And so, 3 to 5 years in some cases, and there's a real rush to be a speed to market rush to get these developments done by these clients. And so if you have a site that can get electric very fast and get a lot of it, you're going to be in a really good spot. But as Chris mentioned, they are even looking at sites that don't have that grid power ready to go. They're looking, okay, well, is there a natural gas line there? Could we get an SMR approved at that location? Can we do behind the meter generation, maybe to get that data center complex ramped up while we bring those transmission lines to the site and eventually plug into the grid? So this is really this is the driver. Having enough electric is the driver, but there are certainly companies looking at how do we get creative here, because the number of sites that have big power off the shelf ready to go is dwindling every day. So 3, maybe 4 site selection takeaways I want you to have. This truly is a generational opportunity in the world of site selection. Absolutely for data centers, and these can be phenomenal projects. They can be great for communities for a bunch of different reasons. And I think Jackie can speak to that really well, but it's also a generational opportunity for everything else, for the rest of the projects that JobsOhio works on. So you've got to plan ahead. You've got to be working with all your stakeholders to figure out what can our sites support. If we did a data center, what would that leave for us? What are the other goals that we have for our community, and how do we best meet those goals? And what are we going to be okay with? How are we going to structure incentives, things of that nature? Number 2, data center companies, they are getting creative. They're getting very creative. They're looking at the types of sites that they wouldn't have looked at before. So don't assume that you can't compete in this space. You may be able to talk to your regional partners, talk to JobsOhio. We can help. And I think they are solving problems that they didn't used to be willing to solve. Number 3, you are in the driver's seat. There's more demand for these sites than there are sites. So I'd say you're in the driver's seat to negotiate these deals. These companies are, Chris alluded to this too, they're great community partners. They want to invest in schools. They want to invest in infrastructure. They want to be part of the solution. So if you have goals, things you want to get done, tell them that. Say, hey, look, we want to work with you on this. We really feel like we need a new water tower. We need to make this kind of investment in our schools. They're willing to make those kind of investments. And in fact, they want to, because they want to be great community partners. Number 4, I would say, make sure you know who you are working with and how solid their proposal is. There's so much demand in this space right now that speculators have rushed into the market. So you need to know who your customer is. You need to know who their customers are. Do they have the funding to do this? Do they actually have contracts, or are they, what's happening in a lot of cases is people are coming in, they're tying up real estate, they're trying to get commitments from a utility on electric, and then they're going back out to the market and saying, okay, now will AWS or Meta or one of these, would you like to buy this site from us? That's not the same as working directly with the end user. There's nothing wrong with that. They see an opportunity and they're trying to take it, but I think you just need to be fully aware of who you're working with and what their intentions are before you make any commitments to them. And the last thing I wanted to mention, Chris talked about the sales tax exemption that these projects enjoy. And I think it's important to note that if that company has 100% sales tax exemption for their data center equipment, for their construction materials, that will include an exemption on the local sales tax. So as you're kind of putting together that pro forma of how do we monetize this project, how do we make sure we get everything that we need to get out of it, just make sure that you're contemplating that you're fully aware of what incentives they already have in place or what they're pursuing, so that you're not counting on sales tax revenue that ultimately you're not going to get. So I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions, or we can just pass it on over to Jackie.
Let's go on to Jackie, and then we have a number of questions that I think we'd like to pose to the whole group.
Okay.
Jackie, you're on mute.
I told myself I wasn't going to do that, and then I did it anyways. So thank you everybody for your time today. Happy to be able to share the insights of the City of New Albany and how data centers have been beneficial for us. Super thankful for our panelists and OEDA to put this together. So just, thank you for all of the partnership for all of those organizations. For some of you that don't know where New Albany is, I think it's just nice to start with some orientation and try to tell you why we feel like we are able to help and give some guiding principles and thoughts here. So we are a northeastern community just outside of Columbus, about just under 20 miles outside of Columbus. Our corporate boundaries are in the blue kind of outline here on the map. We are a strategically planned community, which is one of the most important things about us and something that has been a key to our success. As a result, we have over 11,000 residents, over 25,000 business park employees, our daily operations, which ends up being, this number includes our announced jobs like Intel, which is still under construction, as well as our current jobs and then jobs that are finishing up construction. And then something that I just think sets us apart, which is part of why we've had some success, is our school district. New Albany Plain Local Schools is a top 3% in the state of Ohio. So just to give you a frame of reference of who we are as a community, like I mentioned, we're a strategically planned community. Our planning foundation is through these 4 principles: health and wellness, arts and culture, lifelong learning, and sustainability. This is really important to us because it actually ends up being some of the synergy points that we have with companies that locate here, including some of our data centers. While we see a lot of, I'll call it traffic in the information technology world, we do use the Michael Porter theory of economic development. So we have 6 industry clusters that we are actively working to recruit and retain here in New Albany: health and life sciences, high-tech manufacturing and logistics, the personal care and beauty campus, which is a supply chain vertical for Bath and Body Works that's 1.3 miles in length, corporate office and research and development, the semiconductor industry, and of course, information and technology. Here's a map of our business park for a frame of reference. This is over 9,000 acres. Anything that's kind of in the blue and red is actually what the footprint is for the International Business Park itself. Within that space, we have 36 million square feet of commercial development, which is $47 billion of private investment. And as I mentioned, over the 25,000 jobs. In the information technology cluster itself, that ends up being 14.5 million square feet, over 3,000 jobs, and over $16 billion of investment. So we see, as you can see, a lot of the big names, hyperscalers that we've been discussing today, located within our business park. So why New Albany? Why do I get to serve with this great group of folks on this panel? We saw our first data center investment in 2010, and that was a data center that actually just served one single user, so more of like an edge kind of data center. And then we saw a couple of those. So we have TJX, which is like TJ Maxx. At the time, we had Discover and AEP, all have data center operations over here in New Albany. Then we saw our first hyperscale data center investment from AWS, and have then since seen a consistent kind of traffic of construction. Currently, we have over 15 data centers that are actively under construction at the end of 2024 and into 2025. We're currently home to 24 built data centers, so our portfolio will be around 40 by the time those under construction now are completed. That represents 14 different users, but our highest investments from the hyperscalers, as has been mentioned before. We do have co-locators located here in New Albany. I think that something that, has been a testament to the success of New Albany is a lot of our co-locators now have relationships with our hyperscalers. So for us, they're not really rentable, or they're not really empty. They're actually just going to the use of those that we already have in our community, which is a great thing to see. How New Albany attracts projects, especially data center projects. Obviously, the strategic plan, we update that every 5 years. It does protect the investment of the private company, because where we are locating commercial development has already been vetted by the general public, whether it's residents or city council. So anytime that we go through a rezoning or a tax incentive agreement through a public board and commission, all of those things are actually just very much supported. So that sets the table, and I think makes companies feel like that their investment is going to, be protected for years to come. We do believe fully in shovel-ready sites. So that includes having all of your entitlements, your annexation, your zoning in place, and then any type of tax incentive that you would like to provide. So for us, it is community reinvestment areas and then tax increment finance areas. We do firmly believe and highly suggest anybody interested in a high level of economic development, especially those with data centers, have pre-approved school compensation agreements. For us, this has allowed us to really have a great partnership with our schools, and they understand every time that a project comes that there is a benefit to them that is not just on property tax. Since that is abated, it is allows us to be able to revenue share with them. It also allows us to expedite the process because we have wavering requirements of notice for any time we enter into a CRA or TIF, and so it allows us to move at the speed of business and not the speed of government. Lastly, we do really have infrastructure plans on the shelf. This is allows you to have a roadway that is somewhat designed and be able to bring it to a potential user and say, this is what we envision for a new road or for water or for sewer, and allows you to have meaningful conversations so that you understand as a municipality what you need to do to be able to provide for economic development, but also what potential ways that the company could partner with you to make a project come to life. All of this is capable and able to happen because of the structure of our department. We call it our secret sauce. We are a one-stop shop for community development. And in that are the 5 disciplines of planning, zoning, engineering, economic development, and building. And so that structure allows the people who are negotiating the tax incentives agreements to be able to report and sit at the table with those that are going to help them get the building permit plans reviewed, to be able to have their engineering, pre-construction meetings and anything like that. It's the exact same team. So that has allowed us to move extremely fast, but also to always be very much connected with one another and be able to meet the deadlines that we promise our companies early on. Another key thing for us is our partnerships with One Columbus and JobsOhio. We would not be nearly as successful as we are without these great relationships. It allows us to be able to stay, in tune with projects and make sure that we're making all of the right decisions as a team to be able to be successful and move the projects forward in our communities. We have great public-private partnerships. In New Albany, there is one primary landholder that has owned over 90% of the ground in the New Albany company. This allows us to be able to assemble sites quickly, to be able to help mitigate risk as far as like wetlands or zoning or any of the kind of entitlements that you're looking for. That private partnership really allows us to be flexible and allows us to deliver great product at the end. And the last thing that I'll really get into is, for our community, we created a minimum annual service payment, which is a formula-based payment that all companies, particularly all data centers, have to pay into in order to receive their tax abatement. This allows us to continue to receive revenues that we would receive if the project developed as a manufacturing project or as a Class A office project with high number of jobs. We understand that data centers, while they have low number of jobs and they are, higher salaried, there still could be a potential gap. So by creating this formula, we are ensuring that the city is receiving the revenue that we would otherwise project in the rest of the business park. This has been a really key thing to our success because it's allowed the community to understand the benefit of data centers while not burdening our systems of services, whether it's the police department or snow plows, leaf removal, all of the things that are the amenities that New Albany wants to provide. We're still able to provide that through this formula. So like I mentioned, the formula is part of the CRA agreement. So we're receiving that revenue as if it were to develop as something else. The companies are able to make the minimum annual service payment based on 4 different revenue streams. So we take our TIF funds that the city would receive and we put them into a separate account that allows us to fund our infrastructure. And so I should say some infrastructure. We also have a community authority throughout our business park. This is an additional 9.75 mils of a property tax. Think of a special assessment that is not abated. So the companies are paying that 9.75 mils based on their project evaluation. And it goes into an economic development fund that the city can use for other economic development projects. We also take into account income tax. If through those 3 mechanisms, they do not reach the minimum payment that is established, then the company is able to make a pilot cash payment to cure the agreement. We do set up the formula in a way that it's able to calculate growth through additional phases. And so I would like to be able to kind of present that for you and explain how we arrived at this formula. And I should say that this works for us because this is based on our numbers and the things that work for New Albany. And we have seen and met with many other municipalities who have taken a look at this and have made some kind of formula that would fit for them. So the steps of the formula are to take the site acreage and actually figure out what a base minimum payment could be. So in this example, we did a 50-acre site. And so that base minimum payment for 50 acres would be over $207,000. Then what we have to figure out is how much is that $207,000 buy you in square footage, because we equate all of this to services that we can continue to provide. So we take that 50 acres, we multiply it by 2,500, and then we arrive at a base square footage that is included in that base minimum payment. So for the $207,500, this company could build 125,000 square feet. Now we know most of our data centers are going to build well beyond that. And so the way that we calculate the difference and then allow the payment structure to increase is we take their projected 500,000 square feet, we subtract what they're able to buy with that base minimum payment. And so we have an overage of 375,000 square feet that we know that they are going to build. So we take, that 375,000 square feet, we multiply it by $1.11 per square foot. And then that gives us the additional payment that has to be calculated for the entire project. So we add both of the two payments together, thus our minimum annual payment for this project, which would be 50 acres, 500,000 square feet, is over $620,000. So this payment would be made through the 4 mechanisms that I just discussed. One thing that I always think is really important, while you can see through the formula that there's an exact kind of mathematical equation for us on the economic benefit of data centers, the other thing that Chris mentioned and alluded to is that these companies are top tier level companies. Even the co-locators are looking for ways to be super involved in the community, and they want to. Our pillars, as I mentioned before, are very much aligned to a lot of the things that data centers and their companies would like to do. So we see a lot of involvement in our community foundation. We see a lot of city-sponsored events like our Veterans Day celebration, Juneteenth celebration. We see a lot of sponsorships there. Something that we do require as part of our CRA agreement is we do, in fact, actually require that they be members of the New Albany Chamber and provide, during their annual reports, a synopsis of what they do to participate in the community. So we think that this allows us to keep a pulse on our companies, but it also makes them more likely to do a little bit more since they have to report on it annually. Most of the large hyperscale companies do community grants, or are finding ways to stand up community grants so that they're able to, share the wealth and give some of the nonprofits, the schools, the startups, communities, some capital to be able to build a next phase of a project or evolve a project. The other interesting thing when you think about jobs and kind of initiatives is there's a lot of synergies between veterans and the things that they have seen in their careers and jobs that are needed in data centers. So if you think about data center operations are 24/7, they cannot go down. And so most veterans are in an instance where they were serving on a 24/7 basis. We see a lot of synergies with those in the Navy and some Marines. And so it's been very fascinating to watch the veteran causes momentum increase since we've had a lot of data centers here, but also as opportunities to connect with workforce. So one thing that I think is always important and that we do for any type of economic development project in New Albany is think about the lessons that we learned. What was good? What was bad? What could we do better? And so would love to share all of these with you as you're thinking about potentially joining the journey of welcoming a data center to community or just thinking about good economic development practices. So for us, I think the number one thing is when you have projects that are large scale economic development projects, it is critical to have inspectors and plan reviewers to push those projects through. For these companies, speed to market is money, time is money. And so having people that are able to help you push projects through consistently to code and to your standards is very important. We use contract employees to be able to scale up our staff, whether it's inspectors, plan reviewers, we do it for, engineering review, planning review. This allows us to be able to increase the staff that we have when projects are ramping up into a high level of volume of reviews, but it also allows us to scale down without having to remove any jobs in our community. Everything we do is formula based. So we have fee structures that are for building plan review and then separate from permitting. This allows just for us to know exactly what we are charging and be able to deliver the same charge throughout all of the different projects. In some instances, in other type of economic development projects, it also allows us to be able to provide an incentive on permitting fees, but still receive enough revenue to be able to cover the plan review fees of our contract employees. One thing to note is when you are receiving a data center in your community, you will have a lot of fiber interest. And so something that we have learned also with Intel is to have a policy behind fiber and how you're going to install actual or allow for fiber and wiring to be installed in your utility corridors. What we have learned is a lot of these companies want to have private space, and there's just not enough room in our right of ways. And so the city at one point in time even installed conduit to encourage people to go into the conduit. But many people, because of security reasons, if you think about data centers and how they're even, triangularly located and need to be able to connect to their own data centers with fiber, they don't want to do that in a municipal conduit. So creating a policy, sticking to it, and understanding that, you will see a very high increased number of requests. Another lesson learned that we think is super important is collecting company contacts on a regular basis to be able to share with, media or public entities or people as they're doing construction projects. And this just allows them to be good neighbors. It allows us to be able to make sure that we're connecting people with the right people when they have questions so that the narrative of projects is controlled, but it also allows us to be able to keep them up to date, up to speed, and have somebody that we're always able to connect with. You'd be surprised how many times in some of the past projects before my time here, we spent a lot of time trying to find who is the right person to contact about different things. And so this is something that we do on a regular basis now, is collect the information. One of the last major lessons learned is that the city itself should find a way to have a repository of truth, a way that you are controlling the messages with projects of any size. Especially nowadays with the amount of social media interaction that we receive, it is very important that we are telling our story. And so something that we did when Intel came is we created a website that was the Silicon Heartland website. It actually sends, anytime there's an update to the website, automatic emails to the subscriber list, which allows us to control the narrative and try to reduce some of the messaging out in the community that just isn't correct or isn't accurate. So this is something that we have seen a lot of success with. When Facebook came to New Albany, we actually had the company had a Facebook page about coming to New Albany where they would post updates about vendors and construction and what phase they were on and pictures, and that type of thing goes a long way in a community. And so we definitely encourage that, or at least encourage creating fact sheets that control the narrative about each of the projects. I know that was very fast because I want to keep us on time and schedule. I'm always happy to answer questions and share with my experiences. I think as David mentioned, I've been with the City of New Albany for almost 9 years, and my very first project here was Meta. So I've done a lot of data center projects in my time, and happy to allow us to continue to grow it in the rest of the Central Ohio region and state of Ohio.
So thank you, Jackie. So your first project wasn't a mega project, it was a meta project.
Right.
Which is kind of the same thing. Well, thank
Right.
you so much, Chris, Brody, and Jackie. We have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start from, I believe my friend from the Southeastern Ohio Port Authority down in Marietta, Jesse Roush, is asking, and this I think goes to you, Chris and Brody. Data center development is great for economic growth, except that they're placing a critical strain on the grid. How is JobsOhio encouraging more power generation projects?
So I meet with, I couldn't tell you the number of data centers I keep meeting with. And they're considering, and what we do is we meet with the energy providers, those companies that will build energy sources. It might, and they're called IPPs, and right now the majority of those are natural gas, and they are all over the state. So we try to marry up you know, if they're really coming in to look at natural gas as a behind the meter solution, usually they already have a company they vetted. If not, we already know who could, you know, depending on the region of the state where we could send them. So, you know, and the same thing with an SMR, there's only really two companies I've talked to about SMRs. And that's, you know, the thing to remember on some of these is an SMR is probably a good 5 to 8 years out to build one, because you know, you're just getting through approvals is half battle with those. But the natural gas has a little bit shorter build out time. The issues right now with natural gas power plants and energy sources is the turbines, the components to build it out. And then, you know, that becomes an issue on the timeline for the project itself. So we spend a lot of time. I mean, I spend a lot of time with Matt Sobalski. He's our energy guy, knows all, you know, the back end of that. So you know, I can actually build a SMR in the back of my head, I think, having listened to that so long. So hopefully
There's a couple of things I would add to that, Chris. And first, I would say I'd invite everybody to go check out the energy competitiveness study that was just put out by the Ohio Business Roundtable in conjunction with JobsOhio. There's a bunch of detailed recommendations in there. A lot of it's about streamlining the regulatory processes in Ohio so that power plants can quickly achieve approval for that development, you know, assuming that meets all the regulations, and to lay out a more consistent framework for how to do behind the meter development and generation. So that's the first thing, is there's a lot of recommendations there about how we think we could help make this happen more. The other thing that's a major barrier to power plant development right now is the PJM interconnection queue. If they go to ask the federal regulatory board to interconnect a power plant into the grid, there's hundreds of projects in that queue right now. It's taking 7+ years to get that approval. I think that may be actually the biggest barrier to new power plant development right now. And JO is working with our partners to address that issue with PJM so that these baseload energy generation projects can be reviewed in a timely manner. And on top of that, we're also just, I think to Chris's point, we're consistently talking to power plant developers and operators and gas providers to encourage these projects. But there's just some real regulatory barriers right now that are making it difficult for them. And so we're tackling those.
Thanks, Brody. I think that's, I love both of those points, and I appreciate your comments too, Chris. I know we're having Alexandra Denny from the Ohio Business Roundtable talk about the study at the legislative conference next week, and very, very much appreciate that. Chris, you were talking about SMR, and I know it's come up a couple of times. One of our participants is asking how are communities being prepared and educated on SMR? And then I would add to that, what are your recommendations on how is it being done was the question, and the second question is, and this go to Jackie as well, like what are recommendations in terms of communicating about SMR?
Well, a lot of what we've done, the three of us, we've been getting out around the state, or it's going to be virtual. We only have a couple of regions left, but we're doing this and we're educating on, you know, what an SMR is, because that's, you know, conceptually, and when you look at the design of an SMR, aesthetically, it's more appealing than a natural gas power plant. So those are things that, you know, as they come up, we'll go to the communities, or we'll meet with the companies in the communities and talk about what their energy source and what their preference is. And it's just, you know, and Brody's right. Right now, everything's a matter of time, you know, whether it's equipment buying turbines for natural gas or regulatory processes, you know, there's a mix of it, and it's kind of our job, you know, and we try to make sure the data centers themselves, as they go out into the communities, it is their job to make sure, hey, you know, this is what we're considering, this is what we're bringing. We have to get local approval and support for something like that. And, you know, they're pretty good about it. And, you know, from the natural gas side, we've just, you know, our energy guys really good at that, but we have been going out and doing these kind of presentations to educate people in data centers and those energy sources in a generic way. And maybe it's worth at some point to throw a diagram up there of an SMR versus a natural gas power plant.
I think the one
Jackie,
thing that
yeah,
I
please.
will echo that I think was mentioned earlier, but I want to reiterate it, is the most important thing that we can do as a community is ask questions. You know, what does it look like from a aesthetic point of view? You know, what are the impacts to residents, if any? Um, you know, trying to understand those things, because the more that we educate ourselves and put ourselves as the economic development professional in a position to at least understand it, the easier it is to either get your community on board, or the easier it is to understand if it's something you want or you don't want. And I think all of these companies rather just have transparency. They want to know if the project is going to work or not. And so being able to ask those questions and being able to even share things that are like very critical for you, thinking about an infrastructure, for example, if you know you don't have enough money in your budget to build a new water line, it's okay to say to the client, we would love to have you, but we don't have it in our means to pay for water to serve the site. And you'd be surprised the number of companies that's not going to turn them away. They need projects to be able to do what they need to do. And so asking those questions, and not being afraid to do so, just make us better partners.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's certainly one of the takeaways from this. You're talking about Brody, how the requirements have changed, right, for what's needed. And it's really, I think economic development is becoming much more like, let's work together. It used to be like, this is what we have, and we were hoping someone would take it, but now it's much more of a partnership. So I got an interesting question, Chris, relative to something in your presentation. Helene, my friend Helene from Stark County, is asking, why would Switch locate a data center in Las Vegas where there's a known drought? So that's an interesting question. Don't know if you have the answer to that.
Well, you throw enough money at something, you'll get an answer. And Switch is known for the innovation in their cooling systems. And we actually have quite a few of those type of data centers that are investing in proprietary cooling. So you're absolutely right. The operating temperatures there, you're going to spend more on just AC because you have people working in it. You know, it's a pretty big facility. So it's just about how they invested and the amount of land they needed back when they built that. And of course, they're also ones that, you know, we've talked to about Ohio a little bit more as well.
Yeah, interesting. There was also somebody wanted to make sure they had clarification on one of the numbers you had in your presentation. 1,800 data centers. Is that for Ohio or the country?
That
Anybody's
is
asking.
just Ohio, but you have to remember on that number, that includes every data center in Ohio, whether it is a publicly known entity. In our data, it's any company that has a data center. And a lot of the privately held ones that, you know, most people don't know about, they wouldn't know it's a data center. They're all included in that data, in that number, because there are some that, you know, and in some cases, it's the classification of the data center itself. And that number includes all of them.
Okay, that makes a lot
Hey,
of sense.
hey, David, Alan Branscombe has a really interesting question. If a great data center site happens to be in a brownfield, what level of remediation is needed to implement a data center? Is there a lower cleanup threshold?
I would say that the majority of our clients, when they're looking at brownfields, are looking to have a no further action and a covenant not to sue in place. But that's, I would say, you know, there's maybe some flexibility on that. If the site has enough power, I think they would look at real hard at, even if doesn't have those two, if it hasn't checked those two boxes, I think they would look at it today. If it had big power, you know, megawatt plus, and, you know, some old power plants, things of that nature, there's some companies that are looking at those types of sites, even if they're not ready yet.
Yeah. Great question, great answer. Next one I think is interesting as well. So everybody's talked about, you know, construction jobs, right? We know those are big related to it, and then about high paying quality jobs. So one of our participants is asking, you know, can you break that down into more specific occupations? Like data center technicians is one of the occupations identified. What are the other kind of job classifications for data center projects? And which of those occupations tend to have the largest number of jobs?
Well, typically in a data center, you have network engineers, you have a data center technician, and you've got facilities people that work in those. And they're generally paid a little bit more than what the market rate is. in a data center, especially with the amount of money they're throwing at certain types of data centers. But it all revolves around if you were to build, kind of your own small data center, you'd want to know the networking. That's a network engineer. You'd certainly want the cyber piece of it to protect the equipment in the data center from, threat actors. So it's a mix of between cyber, and depending on the data center itself, you have to have those that have a background and experience in AI. And that's going to be a big one. Now, there are data centers that are going out to rural communities that will train anyone, regardless of your background, as long as you can, pass the interview, whatever they need you to do. You can apply for a network engineer and they will completely train you to be able to perform that job. And that's been a great thing to see as we look at putting data centers out in these rural communities and parts of the state, because some of them are just traveling an hour and a half. Well, if you bring a data center in, even if it's 50 high-paying tech jobs, some of them will completely train them on what they need for that particular data center. There's always, on the lead positions, there's a certification. Not all of them require, a degree. And as we kind of take the position, not us, but the data centers, the certification is always good for, because it's a validation of skills. So we do see that in, on the degree side, you're from a management degree, business degree, you can kind of go up the ladder on that.
I would also echo, we see a lot of community partners actually located in these campuses. Like there's people that are literally responsible for their relationships within the communities, which falls into like the public affairs, like jobs. And then, just to echo what Chris said about the technical schools and the certifications, there's a lot of jobs that can come out of those pathways. And we've seen those partnerships in New Albany.
And keep in mind, one of the mega projects, the companies, we have a great talent services acquisition and you have to remember that if it's a massive need, like an Intel or something like that, they'll build universities, even a community colleges, tech centers, they'll build programs around what's needed for that project. And Intel is a great example of that. So and the community benefits from that, because then you have a pathway to one of those higher paying jobs for somebody who would have never thought they, could afford it, or it was an option for them.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I'll throw this to Jackie to start. Kirby from Cleveland area is asking, what are citizens' typical complaints about data centers? Are there any?
That's a great question. I think more so they're not really complaints, but they're curiosities. A lot of them don't understand what data centers are or why they're so big and large. I think more of our complaints are coming from more of active construction sites managing light, roads when it's muddy, muddy coming from construction site to the roadway. Those are more of the things that we are dealing with as a community. And it's not just data centers, it's just the complaints in general. But I think with the data centers themselves, it's just the lack of knowledge of what they do and how they benefit the community. I was on an interview the other day with a student from OU who has a professor that lives in New Albany, and we explained the minimum payment formula, and his response was, this is not often explained. So that's, I think, part of it is you're giving abatements and they don't understand why we're giving abatements for these large buildings and these large corporations. And it's that we have found a way to make it beneficial to our community. And that's more of what we have been spending our time doing, is trying to educate.
And sound, I would add sound to that, Jackie, that there's, I think, a perception that these things are
Yeah.
buzz, they hear them. And I think the companies are getting increasingly sophisticated about understanding what the decibels are at their property boundaries to make sure that they're not being a nuisance to their neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had to establish some screening requirements, which then became our new norm. So that's why I forgot about it. We have to screen for sight and sound for all of the equipment to try to help mitigate that.
Great. So we have a number of questions relating to fiber. One question is, what about the infrastructure connect the users, fiber data and site selection? Jackie, and you were talking about having a policy. And then a couple other participants were drilling down a little bit and asking, can you tell us more about that policy? How do you accommodate their need in a constricted space for private conduit? Do you require them to use municipal conduit? Then Mark, that was Kirby. Then Mark is asking, does your fiber and wire policy require underground installation? So split up the fiber question.
Yeah, so let's start with the underground insulation. That's easy. We do require all utilities to be buried in our business park. It's part of our zoning district. We use a limited general employment form of zoning. The limited stands for limitation text. So everything utility wise has to be buried underground. The only area in New Albany that currently isn't is leading up to Intel, which took a ton of infrastructure to get there. So everything is currently externally hung while we're trying to figure out how we get all of that buried. So that's a temporary situation for a couple of years during construction. For our fiber policy, we are not yet in the instance of requiring people to use the municipal conduit. I believe that we think it will happen sometime in the future because we will have literally no space in our right of way. And so I think the policy, you know, it actually lives at our service department, people that have GIS systems that understand what's going on, that can get out there and help if needed. That's where it lives. It's evolving. It's growing. I don't know if I have one that's exactly ready to go and share with you. But we definitely had to figure out how to review permits at a better speed than we were and to understand what our max capacity is for utilities, and then actually have been encouraging companies to try to work together because we have a lot of people running the very similar routes. So is there a way that they can partner? So I think we're still working through that and we don't have quite the best answer yet. Just know that we're in the middle of it, trying to understand.
Thank you so much, Jackie, Brody, and Chris. We are out of time, so I'm going to hand the talking stick back over to Mark Barbash to close us out.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. On the screen is the contact information for each of our speakers. I'll leave that up as we close out. As a reminder, later today, you'll get an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the presentations. This has been an unusually interesting presentation because it's dealing with something that everyone is confronting. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you the next time around.